The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica podcast network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Kobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Kobus.
Good afternoon.
Kobus, we've got a great show for you today that we're doing in partnership with our friends over at the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University, also in Johannesburg, where we're going to talk about the challenges facing African journalists in covering China. Now, this is a topic that a lot of people around the world struggle with. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the issues confronting African reporters. And it was a real treat for me to have the chance to speak with Kaiser Kuo, who's really one of the most experienced China watchers out there. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Kaiser, he's the founder and co-host of the Sinica podcast, which in the China podcasting world, Kobus, is the granddaddy of all the China shows. Together with his partner, Jeremy Goldkorn, also a South African just like you. So we have this kind of parallel going on with our show. We started in 2010. They started in 2010. An American and a South African. So it seems to be a successful podcasting model, Kobus. But Jeremy is also another one of the greats in the China watching space. He's the editor-in-chief of the China Project, and he's been writing and analyzing and talking and discussing about China for a very, very long time. So I recommend you follow him as well. But together, those two have built an absolutely fantastic franchise with Sinica. It's really now one of those shows that if you're in the China watching space or you're just moderately interested in China, you have to listen to it every week if you want to stay current with what's going on. And they really interview the who's who around the world who follow China. So Kaiser was the ideal person for us to talk about in terms of coverage of China, and for him to share a few tips with African journalists on what they can learn from his many years of experience in the space. But Kobus, before we get to the discussion with Kaiser, I want to talk to you a little bit about this because this is an issue that you spend a lot of time thinking about in terms of media narratives about China, but also about Africa, and especially this question of the power of Western media narratives and how that influences African news coverage. This has been a little point of disagreement between us, where I take the position that I think in this world today, journalists at the Daily Nation in Nairobi or at Daily Maverick or at The Star, any of these African newspapers have an opportunity and ability to set their own narratives and don't have to rely on what comes out of the US and Europe. But you say, and we've had this conversation many times, that it's just too big and too powerful to resist. Let's kind of start our conversation there.
I think African journalists frequently have a kind of a frustration with Western coverage of Africa specifically. In the sense that it tends to always kind of return to certain kind of core narratives, kind of like illness, dysfunction, corruption, and so on. I think there is frustration among African journalists around those themes, but there's also, I think, a lot of frustration in relation to the kind of lack of coverage of the very specific issues and specific kind of dynamics happening within specific African countries. But all of that is happening within a larger context, I think, where the very kind of conceptual horizon within which all of this reporting is happening still remains set by Western discourses. And so, for example, we recently covered this controversy in Nigeria where they were writing about debt in Nigeria and the rapid kind of increase in debt in Nigeria, and Nigeria has been lending a lot. But these particular journalists were framing it mostly in terms of Chinese debt. And we were complaining, as we frequently do, that debt is an important issue, but the Chinese debt in the case of Nigeria is actually a much smaller issue because it's around 3 to 4% of Nigeria's total debt. Yet the coverage of it was completely in terms of, Chinese debt is going to sink Nigeria. So that's an example, I think.
And just to be clear, that was Nigerian media, not Western media that was doing it.
Yes, Nigerian media.
And we're seeing something similar play out in Ghana as well, where the Chinese only have $1.7 billion out of $55 billion of total public debt, yet the focus is disproportionately on the Chinese.
Yes, the narrative of Chinese debt and the danger of Chinese debt and the debt trap and so on is drifting free of the actual issue, the actual particular debt issue affecting these countries. And I think that, that's an example of this kind of like discursive drift, that happens kind of where the power of an institution like the New York Times, for example, remains very powerful, even if African journalists are also kind of working independently.
So when we look back on the 13 years that you and I have been doing this show, and reflect on China-Africa coverage, how would you assess African coverage of China in that 13-year period? Has it evolved? Has it stayed the same? Has it become more sophisticated? Or in the case of some places, actually it's become more dumbed down? How would you kind of rate overall, especially in places like South Africa, the quality of coverage of China?
I think it's remained surprisingly stable, like surprisingly the same, and in lots of ways kind of stuck in old problems. So in some ways you do see the kind of updating of data. So for example, one wouldn't necessarily see much coverage anymore, or like many allegations of the importing of Chinese labor, for example, as we've seen, kind of 10 years ago. So there's been a shift in that respect, but where there hasn't been a shift is in terms of any kind of like real greater engagement with Chinese realities themselves. Even though there's many African journalists who study in China, for example, I don't think they've really kind of transferred their knowledge and their experience into the kind of the greater coverage of the reasons or the factors behind some of the Chinese actions in Africa. Like, I think there still remains this weird siloing between China as it shows up in Africa and China as it lives in China.
Is it a problem? And again, this is not a leading question. This is genuinely, I'm curious to get your take on this. Is it a problem that so many of the research institutes that provide the data points that frame so much of the coverage are based in the US and Europe? So we think of the China-Africa Research Initiative that Deborah Browdegem runs, or the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or the work that the University of London does. And these are the data points that inform a lot of African thinking on China, but they're not rooted in Africa. They're rooted outside of the continent. Or is data and it doesn't really matter where it's based?
I think on the one hand, those research institutions, obviously they, like most people who focus on China, Africa, research around the world depend on those research institutions. And I think they have done a lot of work in trying to be as balanced as possible and trying to kind of move away from set narratives as much as they can. But, and in that sense, I think they provide a very valuable role and they are a powerful influence. But I think a lot of African journalists don't necessarily dive deep into Boston University loan data when they start writing. I think in a lot of cases, other narratives coming from the West tend to predominate. So we've seen that, for example, like during the COVID era, there's been like some of the kind of narratives around COVID. And this isn't only narratives in relation to China and COVID, but just general kind of COVID narratives. Ended up, the narratives that we've seen coming from places like Fox News, for example, ended up like landing via WhatsApp in African populations and having a kind of a disproportionate impact. So I think popular media narratives in the US actually count for more than these kind of very high-end, kind of bespoke research institutions, which take a certain, in the first place, just simply knowing that these places exist already kind of implies a kind of a engagement with, think tanks and engagement with research, that I think is frequently not accessible to many African journalists because they're working at such resource-deprived levels.
Okay. Well, let's get Kaiser's take on all of this. Now, what you're going to hear is recording that we did earlier in the week as part of a webinar that we produced with the Africa-China Reporting Project. And you're also going to hear from our good friend and colleague, Bongiwe Tutu, who is the project coordinator at the ACRP, and she did a fantastic job fielding questions from the audience, and she also brought this all together, so I want to give her a great shout out and thank her for making it all possible. But she joins us later in the show, so you'll hear her voice in the discussion. But before we get into the deeper issues of the challenges that journalists face in covering China, I asked Kaiser to first tell us a little bit about his background so we understand more about where he's coming from when it comes to covering China.
I started off actually playing music in China I did that for several years, of first as a student there right after graduating, as you did, from UC Berkeley, and go Bears, and ended up shifting into the internet space in about 1999 after I left a band that I'd been playing in, and was working in editorial and working in a very new area, the internet, which was attracting a lot of attention, and was able to make a kind of transition into reporting mainly about telecommunications and technology through the first half of the 2000s. And after that, I sort of ended up mostly as a freelance writer, but then as a bureau chief for a Silicon Valley-based magazine. And then I worked in some technology companies as a communications director, which really has a lot of similarities to journalism in some sense, in that you're kind of an internal reporter. You go around a large organization and harvest the best stories and sort of keep up on what everyone is doing, and you need to be able to talk about really complex technological issues and to be able to work with journalists. That I did until 2010, beginning in 2010, I guess I started the Sinica podcast, Jeremy Goldkorn, and now that has been running like Eric's show for 13 years. And it's not the same kind of journalism that most people are engaged in. I'm very fortunate, like Eric, in having a full hour to unpack complex stories, to be able to bring in much more context, to hopefully bring in multiple perspectives. And I'd like to talk today about some of the ways in which my experience as a podcast journalist has helped me come to some precepts about who I look to when I want expertise on China.
Yeah, we'll get to that, because that's a very important aspect of all this, about providing journalists with, again, some goalposts that they can then kind of guide their coverage around and who to look to for information on that. But let's just kind of maybe step back a little bit and give us a little bit of the landscape of the coverage of China as you see it, because today China is a very polarizing issue for many parts of the world, including in some parts of Africa as well. We just saw this recently unfold in Kenya over the China Square, controversy that happened. So China is a sensitive topic. Maybe you can kind of lay out how you see the landscape today, both in traditional media and social media as well.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think, unfortunately, while I have a lot of admiration, and I think there's a lot to be admired about the way that Western journalists go about their work, and especially Anglophone journalists, that's American, British, Australian journalists, there's a lot to be admired about it. The adversarial approach that they take, I think that it works very well in their domestic markets, talking to domestic audiences about American, say, issues, and I'm grateful for it. For that approach. I don't believe that there is some grand conspiracy among media outlets to defame China, to smear China, to make China look bad. But the fact is that when you take this kind of adversarial approach and you apply it in your foreign correspondence to issues that aren't directly domestic, while you may yield something that is accurate, what is actually factually accurate, it does not add up to realism. You don't get a nearly complete picture. And you end up producing sort of structural bias in the way that people understand country as complex as China. This is also true for any other active sort of foreign correspondent. So let me make that a little more clear. When I read the New York Times in the United States here, I will read a lot of very negative stories about the U.S. There will be yet another unarmed, innocent black motorist, say, gunned down or beaten to death by police officers. There will be school shootings. There will be all sorts of things, political corruption and all sorts of perfidy. But I live here in the U.S. I have the rest of the stories in the newspaper about very ordinary people and their ordinary lives. And that gives me sort of ballast. And so I know how to frame the negative stories. I know how, the sort of proportion of them and how truly descriptive they are of the totality of life in my own country. When I read the 5 or 6 stories that are written about China in that same newspaper, they're going to be about the unusual. They're necessarily going to be, because that's how journalists, you don't write about the bridges that don't collapse or the planes that land safely. You don't write about ordinary people's lives usually. So readers then come to believe that China is made up of all these things. It's an environmental hellscape full of where the government is purely repressive, where everything that the Chinese government does serves only one end, that is to keep the Communist Party in power. This kind of, I heard a scholar that I really admire use the phrase authoritarian teleology, that everything is aimed toward the perpetuation of the state in power. That may be true for many of the things, but it's not all around. You end up with a very negative idea of what China is. And does China do negative things? Of course it does. But this isn't the sum total of it. So that's the problem. And we don't have the ability always to sort through, we don't have the knowledge. I mean, we're entirely dependent. Most ordinary folks are dependent on the media to shape their views of this distant place.
Now, critics would contend that negative narrative that you've just talked about amounts to an agenda of some kind. And certainly looking at this from the point of view of African newsrooms, there is also a similar complaint that the Western and U.S. particular news coverage of Africa tends to focus on AIDS, war, famine, drought, conflict. Do you know what I mean? Like that same type of negative narrative. And so there's this skepticism in many parts of Africa, just as there is in obviously in China and other parts of the world, that it's not just negative coverage. It's agenda driven. How do you respond to the critics who say it's not just the way you framed it, but it's even deeper than that? There is an agenda embedded within some of the coverage about China or in places like Africa as well. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so I think that usually an agenda that happens to all sort of seem orchestrated across disparate, non-connected organizations like that, you can usually look to a more kind of a less malicious explanation. There's usually sort of a more ordinary explanation in things like this. And I think that's the case here. I think there are bad actors. There are certainly some individual reporters and editors who do have such an agenda. But I think broadly speaking about, something very large, many hundreds of media organizations, I don't think that's the case. But individual reporters, I think they're not driven obviously by a desire for money. They go into something else entirely. They're not doing it for money. I think that the structural explanation, which is, it really fits the evidence that I've seen. A lot of reporters are frustrated because their stories about more quotidian, more ordinary things don't make, page one, or they don't make it into the paper at all. A lot of it is simply market driven, that there is, a longstanding saying, and, that if it bleeds, it leads. There is a kind of bias toward the more sensationalistic. And I don't think that the intention is to, now what I think there really is, though, is a self-perpetuating kind of hard narrative shell that once established makes it really easy to keep doing those same sorts of negative stories because you're writing to the reader's expectation. But it also sets up sometimes an appetite for things that go directly against that established narrative. And I've also seen that at work. And so I do derive a little bit of hope from seeing that.
Okay. Well, there's basically two general poles. And again, there's a lot of distance in between these two poles, but on your show, you've talked about panda huggers and dragon slayers. And maybe you can kind of articulate what those two poles are so kind of people can understand the range of coverage.
Well, so these are mostly caricatures, of course, of people, but there really are people who have just sort of a fundamentally skeptical approach to when it comes to China. They will often say, no, this isn't about the Chinese people. I love the Chinese people. It's the Communist Party that I dislike. But they forget that they're talking about an organization of 95 million individuals, 1 out of every 14 Chinese people. And as a recent guest reminded us, they all have, family members and dependents and large networks of individuals that depend on them. So really the party itself is not just the ruling, elite. Most people in the party, most members of the party, the overwhelming majority of them, have nothing whatsoever to do with governing. Most of them are not in a position of either putative or actual political authority. So I think that even this differentiating the party from the people is also a problematic idea. So the dragon slayers are people who are suspicious of China's motives. They usually believe that China intends to displace the United States as the hegemonic global power. It believes, again, in this kind of, teleological authoritarians, or the authoritarian teleology. That means they believe that everything that the party does is intended to augment its own power and to extend its control over not only domestic Chinese politics and society, but beyond that to the globe. They believe that China poses an imminent threat to Western, let's say, interests, and they tend to frame things in terms of an ideological contest. So on the other side, the maybe more extremes are people who, I think in the kind of sort of caricatured version of it, they're people who are usually willing to take China's good faith as a given and believe that Chinese intentions are either motivated by a desire to do good in the world, or at least by sort of less ambitious goals than that maybe all China wants is sort of a regional dominance, say, and they also tend, I think that in the sort of maybe less overtly caricatured version, maybe this is what I would subscribe to, one that would look at China's motivations as really kind of very, very much rooted in Chinese history and very much more complicated and less, a lot of just sort of trying to deal with day-to-day things and muddling through rather than having some kind of grand agenda for taking over the world. I mean, this is such a big question. I don't even know where to start, but
yeah.
I mean, Eric, you know just as well as I do. I mean, you can.
Yeah, I mean, they're the two poles, and in many ways, for example, the U.S. discourse today is dominated by the dragon slayers, in many part because the narratives coming out of Washington are discernibly negative. I mean, there's just no way around it. I'll be honest with you, though, Kaiser, I do get fielded questions from journalists, particularly from newspapers of countries that are quite critical of China. So I just had a journalist from a Japanese newspaper that came to me in the run-up to the Nigerian elections and said, I want to talk about China's negative influence on the elections in Nigeria. And I said, what are you talking about? I don't understand. China is rather indifferent on the elections in Nigeria. It's got solid relationships with both parties. So basically, whoever wins, China's kind of happy with it. Well, they said, well, the debt question is really kind of looming over this election. I said, it is, but, China's debt amounts to 3% of the debt. This is not really a big issue in Nigeria. Debt is a big issue, but Chinese debt is not. And I said, you don't have a story here. I don't know what to tell you, but you don't have a story here. Well, that journalist went off in a huff and then found the story. And what had ended up happening is quoting people who were from Europe, who had no background in either China or Africa or Nigerian elections, and they found the story that they wanted. The same, I've fielded questions from people in the Indian press as well, that come with, a very decidedly, like, this is my angle. This is what I want to do. It's hard, again, for the consumer, though, and for the journalists who are reading this stuff to figure out, okay, what's what. So help us understand, okay, we've got the dragon slayers and we've got the panda huggers. Those are the two extremes. Where do you put yourself on that spectrum? And, and I know you're going to answer this, but I think it's really useful to talk about this middle space.
Yeah, so in the middle space, obviously, but I think that decidedly toward the side of the panda huggers. That is, I think that China isn't treated fairly in aggregate in the media. So that puts me sort of on that side. I mean, and it's because of the narrative domination of the so-called dragon slayers that I react this way. I think that if I saw it tilt too much in the other direction, I would probably be on the other side. My interest is in sort of achieving balance and so I think it's sort of by circumstance that I find myself where I am right now, not because I believe that one side is entirely right. I think to your question about this bad faith journalist, this happens. This absolutely does happen. There are a lot of people. I mean, I've had a veteran journalist, Ian Johnson, on my show who tells me, and you can listen to that show, which was recorded live in New York, and he talks about that, how they'll simply go and find three people who will comment on the record in agreement with a pre-baked hypothesis or pre-baked thesis, and just quote them. That will happen. I think what this speaks to is the dominance of the U.S. media narrative, right, on China. I mean, the sheer force and power in the English language especially, but this is, it's diffused out into coverage by other countries as well. They have enormous power to shape the basic framing of China. And now that, we have this opportunity to talk to journalists in Africa who are covering a story that hits very, very close, directly at home for them, I think this is a great opportunity to talk about some of the ways that they can, do better. So I'm grateful to be here.
Okay, let's dive into that. I mean, For example, the debt trap narrative is a classic example. There isn't any evidence to support it.
That's right.
Professors from Johns Hopkins, the University of London, I mean, I can go down a list of scholars that have debunked it. And yet, you still hear it come from senior U.S. officials, senior European officials, and Indian media. And then what ends up happening is the media quotes those officials, and we have this virtuous feedback loop. And despite the fact that it's been debunked over and over again. Well, not virtuous, but it is a feedback loop. It's a virtual feedback loop.
Yeah.
So the point is that how does a journalist who is new to covering these topics, how do they separate what is known to be debunked, like the debt trap narrative and many of the Dragon Slayer narratives that come out of places like Washington, Delhi, and some of the European capitals? What would you recommend that they do to fact check some of these things so that they can put more balanced factual coverage of China into their own publications?
The unfortunate fact is that most of us who don't spend our entire lives working just on China and aren't steeped in Chinese history and the arcana of Chinese politics, we have to rely on what others tell us. So what I suggest is that we develop a set of sort of litmus tests, that we look for certain habits of mind in the experts that we turn to. We said to be able to discern who is actually worth listening to and who can be or ought to be ignored or dismissed or pushed back on directly. So I would say that there are 5 really important ones. And the first one starts with humility, which, and most of the others sort of flow from this. The fact is there is much that we cannot know. We simply don't. And yet constantly we are seeing these so-called experts claim to know sort of, the precise scale or intent of the Chinese leadership's, what they want to do, to be able to read their minds. So look for a little bit of epistemic humility, people who know that they don't know everything. Look for people who don't call themselves experts. I mean, I think if anyone calls him or herself a China expert, they can immediately be pretty much dismissed. There's no such thing as a China expert anymore than there is an America expert or a Germany expert. I mean, it's even more preposterous when we're talking about one of the 2 biggest countries in the entire world. So a second one I would say that you really ought to look for is somebody who is sensitive to the biases that exist and shows evidence in the way that they answer your questions, in being aware of how issues have been previously framed and aware of our susceptibility to bias as either providers of news or as consumers of news. A third that I think is super important is that they take a holistic approach, a multi-lens approach. Too often, I think, Eric, you're so aware of this, the framing, and this is the case in the debt trap narrative for sure, it ultimately is a national security framing. And so much of how we now look at China is this single lens of national security. We always have this one lens in front of our eyes, and that's really unfortunate because you really need a more 360-degree view of a society and a polity as complex as China. So somebody who at least, I mean, I think it's the humility again comes in here, is you need to understand that your own discipline is insufficient for a full understanding. So somebody who reflexively takes a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary holistic approach is generally preferable. Another one is historical acuity. And by this, I don't mean that they should, know all the ins and outs of thousands of years of Chinese history, or even, the details of 20th or 19th century history. What I really mean is a sensitivity to how their own historical narratives affect the way that they talk about or report on China. The one that you encounter the most is this kind of teleology, again, this idea that history is goal-directed. Americans are terribly susceptible to this idea, and this has been especially so since the collapse of Soviet communism, the end of the Cold War, where we have this notion. It's probably best, and everyone's familiar with Francis Fukuyama's idea of the end of history in The Last Man, but that's one instance of this. But generally, we stand here on this one side of an historical chasm that separates us from countries of sub-Saharan Africa, or from the subcontinent, or from Russia, or from Iran, or especially from China. And we have this idea that they can just simply come over to this side, that they must, surrender to the inevitable siren song of liberal democratic capitalism and just come over to our side and everything will be fine. They don't appreciate the historical, the gravity of history, the gravitational force that history exerts, and the limited possibility of change in a given period of time. There's, at the heart of this, there's this values absolutism that I think not so very long ago, Americans in public life did not embrace. We didn't believe in, something that we now recognize as, universal values. There was this idea that, it was a form of cultural relativism, although relativism has become kind of a weirdly toxic word. Yeah, and then finally, I guess the most important one, I would say it's cognitive empathy. It's this ability to put yourself into the shoes of the people that you were writing about, to look at it. To do this, it requires a little bit of knowledge, quite a bit of knowledge. You need to understand the sort of the values and the institutions, the traditions, the habits of mind of the counterparty, the things that make up the mental furnishing of the people you're writing on, in this case, China. This is true whether you're writing, these 5 precepts are applicable not only whether you are writing, doing reporting in China or about China. If you should be just as critical of Chinese sources and Chinese experts, and for the very same reasons.
One of the things that I've learned, so I arrived in Beijing the first time in 1989 in December. I got my first job anchoring radio in Hong Kong when I was 21 in Metro News in Hong Kong. My first reporting position in Beijing was with the Associated Press in 1995. And since then, I've done quite a bit. And one of the things that many of my best copy editors in China and for these major news agencies told me, and you'll see in my writing every day for the newsletter, this comes through, and I really recommend this. I use a lot of the conditional voice in my writing, and I'm always suspicious of journalists, even Chinese journalists inside China, who write in the definitive voice. It's this, they're doing this. And you'll always see in my writing, it appears though, it seems as if the leadership, and China is too complex, too multifaceted, too opaque in many respects to have that level of certainty. So, Kaiser, your point on humility is really important. So the way that I express that humility is through the conditional voice in the writing. And so I invite everybody to, if you want to see what that looks like, just go to our website and you can pick up any of our stuff. And that's what, when I'm editing here, all of our writers, they say, something definitive. I say, well, can you prove that? And invariably in China, if there's something that's X, there's something else that's Y. And we don't know for sure. And so I think approaching the story with an enormous amount of humility, and that's a trait that I recommend everybody look for in good China coverage versus, I think, less, just crappy coverage or just not as strong coverage. One of these things is that there's always this funny thing about people who've lived in China for a long time, like us, and you and I both have spent more than a decade there, and you see these people come off, the boat for a year, and they're going to write a book, and they know it all. They figured it all out. Does it matter how much time a journalist has spent on the beat?
It does.
Again, you don't necessarily have to be in China. A lot of us are covering China from the outside, and what we're doing is we're covering China in the world. You're covering China in the U.S. predominantly. But in terms of length on the beat, so when you look up a reporter on LinkedIn and you see how much time they've been there, how important is that a factor for someone to evaluate the quality of the coverage?
Look, there are journalists who've been there for a very short time, but they somehow have this sort of perspicacity and good journalistic habits, and they have these things exist independently of specific China knowledge. These are habits of mind that I'm talking about, right? So it's entirely possible for somebody who doesn't speak the language even to do good reporting. If you know how to utilize what you have available to you, if you have really good news assistants and good translators and good fixers.
Which is one of what the critics harp on the most. That says, how can a journalist cover a country like China if they don't speak the language? And I always think, how could a Chinese journalist come to the United States and cover American politics without speaking English?
So I think that in the case of China, it's possible to produce decent journalism without fluency in the language. I've seen it. It can be done. There are enough. It's more difficult for sure. It requires you to work through translators and things like that. But yeah, and they will miss things, absolutely. But it's rare indeed. There are only a handful who I think read Chinese with the same fluency as a native reader. There's you have your Chris Buckley's, and you have people like that, Jonathan Anderson.
But they're not many, though.
but there are not many. But many of them just have conversational Chinese. I mean, it's enough for them to get to the interview and to exchange greetings, but then they need to lean on translators. And I think that's better than overestimating your facility with the language and producing inaccurate reporting. It's tough. I mean, it's not an easy language.
No, it's 35 years of studying, and I can tell you it is not an easy language. Listen, I want to bring back in Bongiwe Tutu, our host and the project coordinator from the Africa-China Reporting Project. Bongiwe has been collecting questions all week. We also want to invite folks in the audience to raise your hand and to join our conversation if you have questions about China, reporting, podcasting, digital media, all of the different things that both Kaiser and I do. We'd love, this is a great opportunity for you to kind of speak up. So Bongiwe, maybe we can go to one of the questions that you collected over the week from attendees.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you also, Kaiser, for that engagement. Really informative. So I'm just going to go to the first question we've received from Cindy Sipula. And they ask, when reporting on Africa-China projects, is it a must to always report on the positives, or we could divulge into its negative side? I guess that also speaks to what you've been reflecting on within the Panda huggers and the dragon slayers. So that is the question, I think, Kaiser.
Yeah, and Kaiser, let me just preface that a little bit, is that one of the points that Chinese news or media entities like CGTN make is that they do something what they call as constructive journalism. Other people just call it propaganda, but the point is that they focus on the positives as opposed to what they say Western media focuses only on the negatives. And so this question that Cindy's talking about speaks a little bit to that bifurcated view of, do we have positive news or negative news? How do you see that?
I clearly don't believe in only reporting the positive. I think that's ultimately that will discredit it will erode your credibility. And I don't think that's what a journalist's job is to do. I mean, that's what PR is for. That's not journalism.
Or propaganda. I mean, that's what propaganda. Propaganda, and again, this word propaganda it has different meanings in different languages. The definition of that I use is information with a purpose.
Right.
Whereas what we do is we put the information out and people get to do whatever they want with it. I don't care if you think it's good or bad. That's not my job. My job also isn't to persuade you of anything. I just do the best job I can at laying out the facts and the stories as I can, and then you do with it as you will. Propaganda, though, is something where I want an outcome from it. Either corporate propaganda, state propaganda. It can come from any number of different types of intents. But clearly the Chinese, like other governments, have a purpose with what they want. They want to promote their agendas, which I don't blame them, but other governments do that too, including the United States.
Look, China is involved with over 50 countries in Africa, over just a myriad different forms of engagement. And if you go into this believing that Chinese motives are entirely pure and altruistic, you will not produce good reporting. If you only have this lens attached that it's a new form of settler colonialism or neo-imperialism, that will also, I think you need to look case by case, even project by project, individual by individual. There are very few sweeping generalizations that you'll be able to make. I think that, you can't just look at the standard gauge rail and the, portable mouth and transfer it to another country in West Africa and assume that the exact same situation applies. I think if anyone in the world is heartily sick of being treated monolithically, when in fact it's a continent of 1 billion people who are with absolutely different languages and traditions and economic situations, it's the Africans. They must hate. And anyone would, being treated as a monolith, so they should avoid it themselves, right? Avoid that reporting.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Bongiwe, let's go to another question.
Okay, so this is basically speaking to the historical understanding of China and with some context to the current governance within the country. And the question is on the Xi Jinping era. Who are the new people in power today, and how do they influence Chinese relations with African countries and the rest of the world? That's
a very timely question, Kaiser, given the leadership changes that we've just had.
Yeah, so, I think that it's really hard to see right now, just based on the biographies of the current members of the Politburo Standing Committee, or even in the composition of the foreign ministry, what changes we might expect when it comes to Africa. There's really not much, but I can sort of generally say about the direction of the new political leadership. There's a lot of people who are saying she has consolidated power and has removed any people who may have been in rival factions or competing factions. That's true to an extent, but the conclusion that many would draw is that he's surrounded himself by yes men and will no longer have sort of accurate information. But there's another interpretation, and I think we've seen it borne out in some instances. Again, humility, we don't know. There's another interpretation that says it's possible he has surrounded himself with people who he's worked with for a long time and therefore trusts, and who trust him well enough to be able to tell him uncomfortable truths. I think that perhaps we can see this having played out in the reversal on COVID, on zero COVID. Eric is in a much better position to talk about maybe how the new leadership affects the global South more generally, but it's very clear in the Russia environment that there's a new initiative afoot.
And I think if you look at some of the people that he's appointed, and let's just go to Qin Gang, who is the foreign minister, who was the former ambassador to the United States. And then he elevated Wang Yi into the top foreign policy official. Wang Yi is a Japan expert. Qin Gang did quite well in managing ties with
Europeanist.
Yeah, he's a Europeanist.
He's a Europeanist by training.
Qin Gang is a Europeanist and also obviously has experience in the U.S. And I think you look at the orientation of the foreign policy team, and it is focused on great power competition. It is there. He stacked his bench with people who are ready to fight. And I think the challenge for African countries and the global South is figuring out, where do you fit in this new era that we're in, which is of the gloves are on and the punches are being thrown. And we see this now in terms of where the Chinese are allocating their time for diplomatic engagements. It's the Middle East, it's Russia, it's Southeast Asia where I'm at. And so I think the challenge for Africa and the challenge for African journalists is to articulate, where do each individual African country fit in this new universe? And I think for the most part, there is been a very serious lag in most African media in getting onto this. I think that we still see a lot of the narratives that have existed for a long time about China and the US and the West and all of this, and they haven't really evolved to reflect the new realities. So whereas the previous Xi administration was much more focused on the global South, I think this Xi administration is much more focused on the big power competition. That seems to me how he kind of stacked his team. What's your sense of that, Kaiser?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very persuasive case. Although I think that the one facet of great power competition will be the Biden administration is waking up to the fact that, when it looks at the way that the UN votes that touch on the Russian invasion of Ukraine have shaken out, they're very worried. They're worried that they're losing the support of countries of the global South, and especially in Africa. And they worry about the sort of, new non-aligned movement that may emerge from this, and China's role in that. China.
Yeah, I was just on that point. I was in a seminar a couple weeks ago, very kind of highfalutin, big name academics kind of thing. And I was speaking, and this professor from Johns Hopkins, who shall remain nameless, came up and said, Eric, with all due respect, Zimbabwe is not important in this new era. This is about the big powers. And I said, sir, with all due respect, I'm very glad that you were not in government during the Cold War with the Soviets, because had you been in government with the Cold War with the Soviets, we would have lost. Because these battles are going to be won and lost on the ability to form coalitions, large coalitions. And I think we've seen, as you pointed out with Ukraine, with Huawei, we can look, again, I pointed out not a single country in Africa has followed the U.S. lead on Huawei. Not one. They've listened politely and said, screw you. When it comes to, all of the warnings about predatory lending, everybody turns the shoulder. The point is, the ability to forge these coalitions is going to be critical in this new era. And that means you have to engage. And to the Biden administration's credit, they're doing it in Africa now. They're sending all the people. The question is, are they going to follow through with the policies and the money and the action and the deliverables? That was still a C. But on the rhetoric side and on the symbolism side, they got it. Certainly much more than the Trump administration did. So it's interesting that, again, I think coalitions are going to be really important. But again, African countries need to be able to articulate what they want out of it rather than just what the big powers want from them. So that's going to be a big challenge. Bongiwe, do we have more questions?
I think one that's quite relevant to the point you've just made, Eric, is a question that's coming from a professor in Ethiopia, and that is, what is China's communication strategy to African people?
Kaiser, let me start this off, but I think there's some things you can pick up on. So the Chinese have a couple of different ways that they communicate, and too often we focus, and as outsiders looking in, on what I call above-the-line communications. And the above-the-line communications, that's the CGTN, that's the television, radio, the newspapers, China Daily, which you see in the hotel lobbies, or you see the inserts sometimes in some of the newspapers. And the fact is, we have lots and lots of data that nobody watches CGTN. It's terrible programming. Nobody listens to China Radio International. It's god-awful boring. And nobody's really reading the China Daily newspaper inserts, okay? So that above-the-line media that captures most of the attention of what Chinese media is in Africa is missing the point. Now, let me kind of talk about below the line, because this is where they're vastly more effective. And this is what's not really seen. And the below-the-line media is the content sharing partnerships, the CSPs. What Xinhua has done is they've basically gone to almost every major African newspaper and said, hey, listen, I know times are tough right now. I know it's hard to afford news agencies. We'll give you a free wire service with photos, with video, with everything. You can use it or not. It's up to you. You can do anything you want with it. You would be amazed at how much content is flowing out of Xinhua, People's Daily, and China Daily through these content sharing agreements. And what's happening is that is automated now into social media feeds. So what ends up happening is that newspaper X in country Y will plug in the news feed. It goes onto their website. From the website, it's scraped and it goes on to Facebook. And the news consumer doesn't really know where the content came from. They just see a headline. This is incredibly effective. The other thing that's been remarkably effective is how Chinese embassies and then Chinese government agencies and media entities have reached out to various African broadcasters and media companies and said, hey, listen, we'll help you rebuild your TV station. So Liberia is a great example. The Liberian Broadcasting System, LBS, they were an old beat-up analog system, and the Chinese came in and rebuilt the entire television network and then put in digital broadcasting. So now people get nice, crystal clear, crisp television in Liberia, thanks to the Chinese. Very small investment. One has to think that will LBS News ever run a negative story about the Chinese? Never. In Ghana, for example, the Ghana News Agency got new computers from the Chinese, new phones. In Kenya, the Kenyan Broadcasting Corporation got new trucks and cars to help with their coverage. This is something that the Chinese have been very effective in terms of supporting African media with, is providing that material support as well. And then the last thing where the Chinese have been incredibly effective in terms of shaping their own narrative in Africa is through these journalism training junkets that they bring journalists over to China. And here's the interesting thing, Kaiser, and this is something we don't understand in the U.S. So when you look at Chinese embassies, and I invite everybody to go onto my Twitter page on China, the China GS Project Twitter, and I've got a list of every single Chinese diplomatic mission in Africa. It's a fantastic list. And one of the things that you're going to see is just a daily feed of infrastructure porn that comes up every day. They'll show you, look at this new highway in Chongqing, look at this new subway station in Sichuan, look at this new airport in, Wenzhou. I mean, just all the time. And we in the US and Europe, and again, I'm not even going to put US and Europe on the same page because I was just in Berkeley and holy crap, the roads in Vietnam are better than they are in Berkeley. Okay, so US infrastructure leaves a lot to be desired. But the point is that we don't value infrastructure the same way that people who don't have any infrastructure, like us in Southeast Asia and in many parts of Africa, so when they go to China and they ride the maglev train from the Shanghai airport to downtown Shanghai, from Pudong into Shanghai, and then hop right into the subway, and then hop right into a train, and then you see the bullet trains and see the 10-lane highways, and then they're told 45 years ago, and you and I both know, Kaiser, from when we were first in China, none of that existed. All of this has happened in our lifetime, okay? They say, this is the possible. And when you talk to people about an aspirational story, And we come talking about democracy and civil rights and LGBTQ, and we talk about, all of those things. And the Chinese come in and say, we're going to talk to you about roads, and we're going to talk to you about trains, and we're going to talk to you about, economic development. We're not going to talk to you about all those other things. We underestimate and undervalue the importance of that when it comes to African journalists. And when they come back from China, not all, to be sure, not all, but many come back very persuaded on the Chinese story.
That's right. The capacity building is an incredible important. I mean, that's what the one thing that I was going to be able to contribute to this. Your distinction between the above the line and the below the line is really, really valuable. I had no idea the extent of these content sharing programs. That's astonishing.
Huge. Oh, if you do a search, you'll see it. And here's what's interesting is that in some cases, it'll say from Xinhua or People's Daily, just like a normal, like a Reuters thing. In other cases, they will take the Xinhua off.
The attribution right out, yeah.
The attribution right off. And in other cases, they'll treat the Xinhua copy like AP and Reuters copy, where a journalist in the newsroom will rewrite it and put their own name on it, but yet 80% of it is still Chinese content. And again, that's how we in newsrooms use AP and Reuters. So it's not, it's nothing different in their view. But I'll tell you how you can look for it is that I saw, for example, Xinjiang stories where they're quoting kind of like the regional party secretary. And you just know that the Malawian broadcasting system is not kind of doing reporting with the interview with the regional party secretary in some remote part of Xinjiang. And so if you are familiar with Chinese news and propaganda and content, you can kind of smell it out pretty quickly. But the average African media consumer is not. And this is one of the reasons why I think they've been extraordinarily effective in how they do a narrative. The other thing that they're very effective on is on social media. And so one of the things when you look at this feed that I have of all of the embassies, you'll see, for example, themes that emerge on the day, whether it is, talking about what Xi is saying. So for example, 20 embassies in one day will have the same message, the same photos. There'll be consistency in the messaging. And you and I both have had experience in corporate marketing that one of the things is that consistency of message across markets is really important. That if market X is hearing something, message discipline. And the Chinese are quite good, much better, in fact, than the US is and even the Europeans are when it comes to this message discipline. These governments are terrible in that. So, for example, the US does not have any coordinator across the continent for its messaging. It doesn't have any social media expertise. I'm not suggesting that the Chinese are geniuses at it. They're just doing it marginally better than the crappy job that the US and Europeans are doing. So basically, you don't have to be best. You just have to be a little bit better. And that's where they are. We're running a little bit short on time. So Bongiwe, do we have any more questions?
Sure. I think we can make time for just one more. And I guess this speaks to the practical experiences of journalists on the ground reporting on China-Africa relations. And they ask, how do you navigate the space when reporting critically and exposing something that would be referred to as negative reporting of China in Africa? Example, illegal logging, illegal fishing in African countries.
Okay. So I'll get to the Africa part because we've done quite a bit on that. But let me just give the stage to Kaiser to talk about how do you cover China critically and negatively. You've said that on the spectrum, you're more on that panda hugger side, but at the same time, you've been very critical as well, especially when you're talking to Chinese stakeholders and Chinese officials. How do you convey a more skeptical, critical view to Chinese officials?
Well, they don't make it easy. I think that, anyone who's worked as a reporter in China as on the ground, there is a lot of stonewalling. They make it difficult to get access to write the stories that you want to write. And that's whether you're writing about individual enterprises or you're trying to talk to government ministries, anything at all, any agencies, it's very difficult. It also, in the worst case, you are sometimes surveilled, harassed. You will even sometimes be detained. It's never happened to me for my reporting, but I have friends who have had this happen to them in China. It's not an easy thing to do, and you can only sort of persevere and, keep at it. But I think that if your reporting is in good faith, I think you can usually find people who will recognize that and understand that, you're going to write a story that's going to be fair and it's going to bring in other voices. You're going to be writing about illegal logging, or you're going to be writing about, violations of territorial waters by Chinese fishers. But it's possible to do. That reporting, of course, takes place mainly outside of China. So, in the countries where these activities are happening. And I think you are at less direct risk there. Eric, maybe I can hand off to you and you can talk about how these get reported out.
Yeah. So one of the challenges in covering kind of illegal Chinese activities in Africa is that oftentimes the Chinese stand out much more, and it's very important to make sure the context is correct. So when we talk about, for example, the Galamsey in Ghana, which is the illegal mining, that a lot of the focus is on the Chinese, understandably so. And the Chinese have been engaging in, again, this is Chinese illegal mining activities in Ghana in this space for as long as I've been covering it, which is more than 13 years. Couple very important distinctions here. That when we talk about Chinese illicit behavior in African countries, oftentimes we say the word Chinese, and then people equate that with being the Chinese state as much as individual actors. And the Chinese state, at the end of the day, has no control over the behavior of illegal migrants that are in any country, just the same way that any government doesn't have an ability to control through their embassies the behavior of their nationals in a foreign country. So really important to distinguish between when you have illegal mining in the Congo, illegal timber activity in Cameroon and Nigeria, those are individuals, they're not representatives of the state. In some instances, there have been allegations that Chinese state-owned enterprises are involved in some of these activities. Now, even though those are Chinese state-owned enterprises, I know this is going to sound weird and it's not an excuse, but believe it or not, they don't work directly for the state in the sense of taking orders from it. Many times they're operating out of their own self-interest in what they're doing, and they're highly, highly autonomous. The last point on this part is putting context. As I said in the beginning, oftentimes the Chinese will stand out a lot because they're new actors in many African countries. They're very visible. But when we look at, for example, in Ghana, the numbers of Nigerians who are arrested for illegal mining, it's vastly larger than the numbers of Chinese. And again, that's not to point fingers, but it's to put context. When people talk about Chinese mining in Africa, many people think of the Chinese as the big player in Africa, when in fact, the Chinese account for only 7% of total mining output in all of Africa. Anglo-American, just one company, is double that, okay? So context becomes really important when we're talking about Chinese illicit behavior. That being said, the Chinese, again, they've promised that they're going to crack down on illegal behavior. Oftentimes when people are caught to do illegal things, they're handed off to the Chinese embassy. They're then deported. We never hear if they're punished back home. The Chinese could benefit enormously if they provided some transparency, or they insisted, this would be the best output, is that if somebody does something wrong in a country, the Chinese embassy would support that individual is punished and does jail time in that country. The same way, by the way, that if I did something bad in China, I'm not deported to go home to the United States to serve my jail time in the United States. I would be doing my jail time in China. So, for example, we just see over and over again that people who do bad things are deported and never heard from again. We don't know if they're actually being punished or not, or they get off the plane in China and they just go on with their daily life. So that's really important. The last part of all of this, and this has been my frustration in watching a lot of African coverage about Chinese illicit behavior in Africa, is the focus is on the Chinese side as opposed to on the domestic governance side. The fact is that when somebody of any nationality engages in these type of legal behavior, it's generally because there's a breakdown in law and governance in the host country that gives that space to do that. And so the pressure really needs to be put on the host government to do more to enforce its own laws, irrespective if people are from China, Lebanon, Nigeria, wherever. And I think that's kind of the final point. So again, context becomes really super important. Kaiser, I want to give you the last word here about your recommendation to African journalists, the people who are watching us live doing this, also online, and then in our podcast show. Give us a final piece of advice in terms of how to cover China going forward, given everything that's going on today.
Yeah, I'd say just simply, think critically about the received narratives that you have. I mean, whether they sort of derive from the Chinese telling of the story of China in Africa, or from the very often overly critical Western telling of it. I think you need to arrive at something that's independent, that centers the African experience, that restores agency. I think this is one of the most frustrating things. And, just now you talked about this. I mean, the sort of negative side of it is that too often China is blamed as the external actor when governance issues domestically are blamed. But At the same time, there's often this sort of infantilization that we've talked about so many times where the Western narrative sees these African governments as sort of helpless, like they can't take responsibility for the debt that they take on. And finding a voice that resists received narratives from either side is what I would say you should keep as your lodestar.
Cobus, that was such an enlightening conversation. And again, it's a treat for me because I don't get the chance to speak with a guy like Kaiser for an hour uninterrupted. And so I don't know, I really enjoyed it. It's a lot to absorb. The key takeaway for me from it all, though, was that point he made about humility. And it's a weird thing to talk about, but especially in this culture of social media where humility is not a prized personality trait. When you go on Twitter, it's all about, here's what I know, and shouting from the rooftops. But humility in covering China, and I'm going back to your point about the frustrations that people have in covering Africa and how Africans recoil at so much of the Western media coverage as well. There's a lack of humility in it as well. And it's the point that we, in our coverage of Africa, of China, of other places, are constantly writing in that conditional voice I mentioned in the conversation. Seems, appears, may be. Because, again, things are changing so fast. These stories are so multifaceted. But I really take to heart what Kaiser said about humility in the coverage and on the part of reporters.
Yeah, it's so important because one can never know what's going on, right? You never know, even in a situation where say one is an American reporter and, there's this full kind of cultural and linguistic kind of overlap between them and, say, the White House. They still don't know what's going on, kind of behind closed doors. They can find clues, they can find indications, they get accounts from people and so on, and that is the job of a journalist, and weaving that together is the job of a journalist. But one has to always keep in mind that one doesn't actually know what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, and it's this idea, too, that the topics of China, Africa, and here in Asia, these are populations of billions of people. And oftentimes you have to write about the Chinese in such a way that it flattens all of them. This is the frustration that we have when we in the African news space as well, that talking about Africa as a singular entity is ridiculous. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Yeah. But it's the same in Asia too. But I find that people will oftentimes put an extra burden on the Chinese and Africans in terms of this simplification. So here in Asia, I don't hear the same idea that we talk about Asia as a continental entity, the way we talk about Africa as a continental entity, and the same way that they talk about China. And we talk about this a lot in our coverage, that the diversity of actors in the China-Africa space is so varied, but yet in so much of the African media coverage, and really much of the coverage writ large, it's just the Chinese. And so one of the key tips that I would like to kind of put forward, which I didn't mention in the conversation with Kaiser, is to really be very precise on who you're talking about when it comes to the Chinese. Is it Chinese illegal labor or illegal migrant labor in places like Ghana doing illegal gold mining? They don't have anything to do, again, we talked about this earlier, with the state or a company. Or is it a Chinese state-owned enterprise? Or is it a private company? They're not all the same. The same way that, again, we've talked about this in the context of Africa, that, Uganda and Egypt are on the same continent, but, often have very little in common. But yet when we say the word Africa, it just flattens it all out. And I think we should resist that in the China context as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's particularly important in the China context because there are such disparate and very powerful players involved, the priorities of a Chinese company is different. They're different from the priorities of the Chinese government. And pretending that they're the same doesn't help anyone. It doesn't, even though in many cases, I think that kind of flattened coverage is also a reflection of, kind of historical ways that Africans kind of interacted with external power, it's, for example, one can make very nuanced distinctions between, say, the Catholic Church and Glencore and the Swiss government and the European Union. They are all obviously very different kind of institutions, but they all are manifestations of Western power that operated together in key ways in Africa. So one can see how that kind of flattening can indicate a kind of a savviness in terms of how power works. But in the case of China, it tends to, what I frequently find, that it tends to actually obfuscate more than it helps, because it erases, it provides this kind of like illusion that everything is centrally coordinated out of Beijing, that even the most kind of like isolated Chinese migrant is somehow this kind of agent of the Chinese government, which just doesn't make sense. It's just not realistic, so it ends up being very unhelpful.
It's ridiculous. And that everything is related to the Communist Party and everything is related to the Chinese state. And again, that's becoming very much the narrative in the United States as well. One last point that I'd like to make before we wrap up is this question that I get quite a bit of: how can a journalist in Africa or elsewhere get up to speed on some of these China issues? And I tell them that I've been doing it since I was a teenager, and I'm 52 now. And I've been literally doing it since I was 15 years old. And I still feel like I don't know very much. I mean, it's just the nature of what thinking about China is that it's the puzzle that could never be solved. So that's not meant to intimidate anybody. It's meant to say, just get started. But this is not an easy topic to pick up. This is not something that you can read 1 or 2 books and then all of a sudden feel like you know what you're talking about. It takes daily commitment. It's like an exercise regimen. You got to commit to it. And this was a debate that we have quite a bit internally at the China Global South Project and that I've had with our readers. And I'd like to get your take on this. Some readers will tell us that our articles and our coverage is too long, and they can't read it and they can't get through it every day. Others will say to us, no, give me everything. I need as much as you can give me. And so we fluctuated a little bit. Do we do the Axios style, here's the quick kind of headline of it all, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, or do we actually provide some background, provide some context, provide some explanation for these stories? And I've started to lean much more towards the give more than less, because you have to just spend the time to do it. And if you say you don't have time to get into the subject, then okay, then you're never going to get into the subject. But this is not something you can do on the cheap. You need to make a commitment to understand the complexity of what China is and all the variety of actors who are participating in it, this massive history that they have, the complexity of their relationships around the world, and how what we're seeing now in Russia and with the Iranians and the Saudis, how China's diplomacy and foreign policy are changing really fast. Okay, it's evolving very quickly, but there's no shortcut here. And that's the part that I get a little bit frustrated for, is that people say, I need the quick fix. And you don't get that with the China story.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for that need, because people are busy and they have a lot of stuff to read. We end up basically doing both, right? We give short bullet pointed things. We always have a section, why is this important? And, essentially people can skip, just read those and, be kind of up to speed. And then we offer each time a little bit of a deep dive, because the thing is on the reality on our side is that it's by far the bulk of coverage of important notable coverage we leave out because it's just too much, so we have to keep the stuff, even though our newsletter, I think today particularly because I also added a long column at the beginning on Xi's visit to Moscow, so sometimes our newsletters are long and they go several pages, but they still represent the bare minimum of the coverage that happened, what we saw as the most important, most notable, most kind of, making the points that will lead to further thinking, those are the ones that we try and select and provide every day. And so it becomes this kind of weird combination of, where you're giving people a bouquet of flowers, but sometimes that bouquet of flowers weighs 20 kilograms, so it's a difficult combo.
It is. But it does take sometimes that heft in order to get it. Let me just leave everybody with a few recommendations that if you are interested in learning more about China, and you want to start investing the time to do it, I recommend, of course, to sign up for our newsletter that our team puts together. And we're really the only one out there in the marketplace that's focusing every day as detailed coverage of the global south, of the developing world, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America, and South Asia. Much of the rest of the coverage is focusing on US, China, Taiwan, Europe, China. That being said, incredibly valuable resources. So number one, obviously the Sinica podcast with Kaiser. Number two, I would recommend Bill Bishop's Sinocism newsletter. We get that every day. That is, again, like Sinica, that is a Bible that people in the China watching space follow. Everybody basically in the China watching space gets Sinocism. And I'll put links to this in the show notes as well. There's the China Project, again, that's affiliated with the Sinica podcast. They're excellent as well. And I think if you take that plus this new bouquet of newsletters that have flourished. So we have Discourse Power by Tuvia Gehring, who is doing a lot of the translation of what academics and scholars are doing. Sinification's another newsletter. And by getting these newsletters, subscribing some of the paid services, listening to the podcast, and you do this on a regular basis, in time you will get up to speed. And then to pick up a few deep dive books. And the books are really important to give you this sense of history of where the Chinese are coming from. So a lot of the newsletters and the stuff we do is on the contemporary coverage, but you also need that background. The last thing I would recommend is, and this again is a big ask, I know this, but is to take some time to study Chinese and the language itself. And you'll understand the way of the thinking and the way that ideas are structured. You don't have to necessarily become fluent, but even just taking 1 or 2 introduction classes just to see how the characters are written and just to see how the grammar is structured really helps to better understand people, culture, ideas, and whatnot. So
I would really echo that. There's these ongoing debates, kind of in the China space about how important it is for people to be fluent in Mandarin when they're Chinese watchers. I tend to think it is important, but I don't think it's important necessarily for the reason that these people say it is, which is, kind of that you get some kind of magic ticket where you just fully comprehend what's going on in China. I think it's the opposite. It's like language learning brings you face to face with how different Chinese is as a language. And that, again, it's a humility-inducing interaction, kind of like, and a very important one. It's really important to face how different communication is, how different the words are, how different the phrases are, in order to then try and provide a bridge.
And I just love how it enhances the interactions you have with Chinese people when you get a chance to meet people and just to say a few words, and it just breaks the ice and it just shows, again, a humility. That's the word of this show. It shows a humility that you've taken the time to learn somebody else's culture. And that shows respect. And I just love that. And that's why I've enjoyed studying Chinese for all these years and kind of immersing myself into it, into the history, the politics, the language, and all of it. So again, it is these people become obsessed with it. And I'm, raising my hand right now. I'm definitely one of those people who's obsessed with it. So, okay, well, let's leave the conversation there. What a fascinating discussion. Apologies that it went on a little bit longer than we normally do, but a real treat for us to have the chance to speak with Kaiser and also to get Cobus's take on some of these issues that we think about a lot, and also to give you a little bit of the backstory of what we're doing here at the China Global South Project. If you'd like to support the work that we're doing in the independent journalism that all of our editors in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are doing every day in Arabic, French, and English, bringing the China story to these new markets and these new audiences. And again, expanding the discourse in Arabic and in French, where there really is nothing compared to what it is in English. So if you'd like to support that work, we'd be so grateful for you to sign up for a subscription to the China Global South Project. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We'll give you 30 days to try it out for free, and then hopefully you'll enjoy it and keep on with us. Once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.